Welcome to my latest video series titled Do Faith and Science Conflict? It has 7 parts. Part 1 introduces the objection, which is the commonly believed idea that faith and science conflict. Parts 2 through 6 address that objection, and Part 7 discusses the implications of Parts 1 through 6. Let's consider taking a more philosophical approach to reconciling faith and science. Most of us have probably heard this or that scientific argument trying to reconcile them, but I doubt you have heard this done philosophically. I believe that such an approach is lacking, which is why I chose to take it here. Why is this approach important? Well, many debates concerning faith and science don't even get off the ground because faith is often ruled out before the debate begins. So giving evidence for faith is ineffective. The objector has already ruled it out on the basis of what they think is science. But this basis, as we will see, is not really scientific, but is for the most part philosophical. That is, arguments that are actually philosophical in nature are often disguised in the language of science. So I will address these philosophical arguments philosophically. In part 1, I will introduce the topic and give some relevant background info. So what is faith and what is science? Science is the careful study of the structure and behavior of the physical world. Note that science only studies the physical world and not things that aren't physical. For example, astronomy is the study of celestial objects and outer space, or botany is the study of plants, or chemistry is the study of the elements and the compounds they form, or physics is the study of matter and energy. Now, it is common in today's culture to pit science against faith, which we define here as belief in God or in a set of religious doctrines. There are many types of faith, and subsequently many ways that you could define it. I chose this definition because it is this type of faith that is most commonly pitted against science. Also know that I will be referencing the Christian religion, although the arguments I make could theoretically be used to defend other types of religious faith. Now, we all know that religious faith exists, and so do its enemies. Therefore, the question is not whether faith exists or whether science exists, but whether or not they can coexist. About this topic, 2 major views are proposed. View number 1 is that of the Bible, and it is that the study of science points us to religious faith. In other words, science cannot directly prove positions of religious faith, but it can certainly point us in that direction, like a road sign would point us toward a destination. Here are a few examples. A position of faith, which will henceforth be referred to as POF, in the Bible is that God created the universe. Remember how science only deals with physical matter? Since the creation of the universe was supposedly a supernatural event, science cannot prove or disprove this. Yet the Bible gives what it claims is evidence for this position of faith. This includes the order in creation, so people are to look at the design and nature and infer that it has an all-powerful creator. Or there are our consciences, which are meant to point us to a source of our moral values. You can see the references for these evidences in the right-hand column. I am not saying that any of these positions of faith or their evidences are valid, at least not here. I am only saying that the Bible merely proposes the idea that science can point us to religious faith. So God creating the universe is not scientifically testable, but its evidences are, which point us to a creator. I am using the terms evidence and science interchangeably here because at the time the Bible was written, modern science had not been invented yet. So the evidences it gives are the ancient equivalent of modern science. So my point is not affected. Had the Bible been written in a more technologically advanced time, I suspect that it would have referenced more technical evidences. But moving on, another position of faith the Bible proposes is that Jesus is God. Since some of God's attributes dwell beyond science, such as him being supernatural or timeless or immaterial, it is impossible to show, scientifically speaking, that any given person is God. Remember, science only deals with what can be measured. You cannot contain an infinite, timeless being in an experiment that only deals with finite quantities. One can only give evidence for a claim like this, which the Bible does in abundance. This includes Jesus performing miracles or Jesus fulfilling Old Testament prophecies made hundreds of years in advance. Or Jesus is said to have fulfilled not just prophecies, but theological themes of the Old Testament, like fulfilling the Mosaic Law. Lastly, there is the evidence surrounding the resurrection. All of these are meant to point the reader to that which is supernatural. One might say, but didn't Jesus tell Thomas that those who believe without seeing are blessed? And Jesus isn't saying believe without any evidence. The context of that verse is that Thomas had every reason to believe in the resurrection, but still doubted. One last example is that the Bible records a miraculous catch of fish in John chapter 21. Now, there is no way to prove, scientifically speaking, that any given event is a miracle. A miracle has supernatural involvement, which science is not designed to test. However, the text gives certain evidence that points us toward religious faith. This includes the idea that the disciples had caught no fish all night, that the fish all swam to one place, that is, the net, and the sheer number of fish, 153 to be exact. It is perfectly natural to spend a night fishing and catch nothing, or to have fish swim in a net, or for 153 fish to exist. But the Bible proposes that having all these events happen simultaneously is evidence of supernatural involvement. It is natural events working in supernatural ways. So many religious positions of faith are not scientifically testable, but that does not stop books like the Bible from giving evidence for them. It is important to note that these positions are reached completely by faith. They are not scientific. It's not even part science and part faith. It's 100% faith. Science cannot even begin to grasp something like a miracle or creation or the God who does those things. The evidence comes in merely as a tool to show us if our decision reached by faith was accurate. That is viewpoint number one. The opposing view, which is commonly advanced in our culture, is that faith and science are mutually exclusive, meaning they cannot coexist. One must choose either one or the other. Faith and science contradict. This idea could be interpreted in many ways. It could mean that faith contradicts the scientific method. In other words, faith has findings that are non-falsifiable, meaning that they cannot be proven false, while the scientific method can test only what is falsifiable. Or it could mean that faith contradicts the scope of science. In other words, faith is not a reasonable explanation for anything, and science explains everything there is. Or it could mean that faith contradicts the findings of science. For example, some think the Genesis account of creation differs from modern ideas of evolution. Or it could mean that faith contradicts scientists. In other words, not many scientists practice religious faith, so neither should we. Or it could mean that the miracles that are commonly associated with religious faith contradict science. So one could object to faith from science for many reasons. I included two pictures here to summarize the opposing views. The first is of a waterfall, which represents the biblical stance. Imagine you are in a boat approaching this waterfall. You can only observe the flow of the river around you. This flow represents the evidence in science. You also know that there is a waterfall up ahead, but you cannot see beyond it. The waterfall represents the position of faith. Just as you cannot see the waterfall, we cannot directly observe the position of faith with evidence. But it would be folly to ignore the waterfall because it is a position of faith, for that is what the evidence points us toward. The second picture represents the secular view. This woman chooses between two options, A and B, which represent religious faith and the pursuit of science. It is commonly believed that one must choose either one or the other. So you can be religious if you want to, but just know that if you are sacrificing your intellectual integrity. You cannot be both. These objections to faith are summarized in this outline, which we will refer back to repeatedly. Under each objection, I have a series of rebuttals that I will give, all of which support the thesis that religious faith does not contradict science. I believe that the heart of the conflict between faith and science lies in objection 1, that is, in their methodologies. Therefore, I will spend the most time addressing objection 1. The other 4 objections are not quite as central to the debate, but are nonetheless meant by many who object to faith. This is the only reason I am addressing them. It isn't because they are inherently related, but because they are commonly made. That is the end of part 1. In part 2, I will address the first of our objections, which is that faith contradicts the scientific method.